A teenage girl walked through the flood with a baby in her arms. Then the Hell's Angel stepped in. The smell of bacon filled the small kitchen on Maple Street. Emily Parker stood at the stove in her worn-out blue socks, pushing the strips around the pan with a spatula. The morning light came through the window above the sink, pale and soft, falling across the yellow walls her mom had painted years ago. Emily always noticed the walls in the morning. They still felt like her somehow. "You're burning it again," her dad said from behind his coffee mug. "I'm not burning it." Emily peeked at the pan. "Okay, maybe a little." Walter Parker laughed. It was a warm sound, low and easy, and it filled the kitchen the same way the bacon smell did. He was a big man with wide shoulders and kind eyes, still in his undershirt, his volunteer firefighter jacket draped over the back of his chair. He looked tired. He always looked a little tired. But he always made time for breakfast with Emily. Every single morning. She slid the bacon onto 2 plates and carried them to the table. He was already setting out the orange juice. They moved around each other like they had done it 1,000 times, because they had. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. "You've got the Henderson project due this week, right?" he asked, sitting down. "Thursday." Emily poked at her eggs. "It's a group project." "And?" She shrugged. "And nobody really asked me to be in their group. I sort of just ended up in one." Walter put his fork down. He looked at her the way he always did when something she said mattered more than she meant it to. "Emily." "It's fine, Dad. Seriously." "You are not invisible," he said. "Even when you feel like you are." She didn't answer right away. She stared at the yellow wall instead. Her mom had picked that color on a Saturday, had called it sunshine on purpose. Emily had been 6 years old, standing on a step stool, holding the paint roller with both hands, while her mom guided her arms. The memory was soft around the edges now, like a photograph left in the sun. "I know," Emily said quietly. Walter reached across the table and squeezed her hand once, short and sure. That was his way. After breakfast, he pulled on his jacket and grabbed his keys. He paused at the door. "I might be late tonight. They're talking about some weather moving in." "I'll be fine." He pointed at her. "Lock the doors and check on Sarah if you get a chance. She's been alone with that baby all week." "I already planned on it," Emily said. He smiled. "I know you did." Then he was gone. Emily walked next door to Sarah Bennett's house around noon, carrying a small container of the soup she had made the night before. Sarah answered the door with Noah on her hip, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes. But she smiled when she saw Emily. "You are an actual angel," Sarah said, taking the soup with her free hand. Noah reached toward Emily immediately, his chubby fingers opening and closing. She took him without thinking, settling him against her side the way she had learned over the past few months. He smelled like baby shampoo and something sweet. He grabbed a strand of her hair and held on tight. "He missed you," Sarah said. "I missed him too." Emily meant it. She stayed for an hour, holding Noah while Sarah ate and rested. The baby watched her face the entire time with his big brown eyes, serious and curious, like she was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Nobody had ever looked at Emily like that before. By late afternoon, the sky had changed. Emily stood on her front porch and looked up. The clouds had rolled in fast, heavy and dark green at the edges, pressing down low over the rooftops of Maple Street. The air smelled like metal and wet dirt. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again. She looked at the screen, 3 emergency alerts, all arriving at once. Flash flood warning. Seek higher ground. Immediate danger. Down at the end of the street, water was already pooling at the curb, spreading slowly across the asphalt in a thin, shining sheet. Emily's stomach dropped. The rain came down like a wall, not the soft kind that patters on rooftops and makes you want to sleep in. This was fierce and loud and angry, hammering the windows so hard Emily stepped back from the glass. The sky had gone the color of a bruise. Lightning cracked somewhere close, and the thunder that followed shook the floor beneath her feet. Her phone rang. Dad. Emily. His voice was tight. She could hear wind and shouting in the background. I need you to listen to me right now. I'm listening. Do not go outside. The creek on the east side already jumped its banks. We've got water moving fast through the lower neighborhoods. A burst of static. Stay in the house. Move anything important to the second floor if you can. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine. I'm with the crew. Another crash of sound on his end. Something loud and metallic. I'll call you as soon as I can. I love you. I love you too. The line went dead. Emily stood still for a second, holding the phone against her chest. Then she moved. She grabbed the important things first, her mom's photo from the mantel, the small wooden box her dad kept his documents in, her backpack. She carried them upstairs, her socks slipping on the steps, and set everything on her bed. Then she went back to the window. What she saw made her breath catch. The street was gone, not flooded the way puddles flood a sidewalk after a normal rain. Gone. The entire road had become a moving river, dark brown and churning, carrying leaves and branches and someone's plastic lawn chair spinning slowly in the current. The water was creeping up the front lawn now, fingers of it reaching toward the porch steps. The neighborhood looked nothing like itself. Mrs. Calloway's flower boxes had been knocked from her windowsill. 2 garbage cans bobbed past like strange little boats. The big oak tree at the corner was bending hard in the wind, its branches thrashing. Emily pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. The water was still rising. She watched it climb the porch steps. First step, then the second. She counted without meaning to, the way you count when you are scared and need something to hold on to. Lightning turned the sky white. In that half-second of bright light, she saw the whole street at once. The flooding was not slowing down. It was not evening out. It was building, pushing forward with a kind of purpose that felt almost mean. Emily stepped back from the window and wrapped her arms around herself. Her dad had said to stay inside, so she would stay inside. She was fine. The house was solid. The second floor was dry. She just had to wait. She told herself that twice. Then she heard the pounding on the door, 3 heavy knocks, then 3 more, frantic and fast. Emily ran to the front door and yanked it open. Sarah Bennett stood on the porch, soaked completely through. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her eyes were wide and rimmed with red. She was shaking, her whole body trembling, and she was holding Noah pressed tight against her chest with both arms wrapped around him like a shield. Noah was crying, a high, thin sound that cut right through the roar of the storm. The water behind Sarah was already at the base of Emily's porch steps, swirling dark and fast. Emily. Sarah's voice broke. She could barely get the words out. It came in under my doors. I couldn't stop it. It's inside now. It's rising and I can't. She pulled Noah tighter and her face crumpled. Please. I didn't know where else to go. Thunder exploded over the house so loud Emily felt it in her chest. She grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her inside. Sarah stumbled inside and Emily pulled the door shut behind her. The wind fought back, pushing hard against the frame, and it took both of Emily's hands to get the latch to click. The sound of the storm muffled slightly. Not much, but enough. Sarah stood in the entryway, dripping onto the floor, her chest heaving. She looked down at Noah and checked him all over with her eyes the way mothers do. His little face was scrunched and red from crying. His white onesie was damp at the edges, but mostly dry, because Sarah had kept him tucked so close. Shh. Sarah pressed her lips to the top of his head. Shh, baby. It's okay. He didn't stop crying, but he slowed a little. Emily moved to the window beside the front door and looked out. The porch steps were gone now, completely covered. The water was a flat, moving sheet that stretched from house to house across the whole street, and it was still climbing the front of the porch. "We need to get to the second floor," Emily said. "Is there a way out from up there?" "There's a window over the garage roof." Emily turned from the glass. "If we had to, we could get onto it." Sarah nodded. Her jaw was tight. She was thinking hard, Emily could tell, working through something in her head the way people do when they are scared but trying not to show it. "The shelter is on Birch Street," Sarah said. "The community center. They announced it on the radio this morning." She shifted Noah to her other arm. "If we could get there? That's almost a mile." "I know." They looked at each other. The water touched the bottom of the front door. A thin, dark line of it appeared along the floor, spreading slowly across the tile like something alive. "It's coming in," Emily said quietly. Sarah looked down at it. "Yes." Emily grabbed her rain jacket from the hook by the door and pulled it on. Her mind was moving fast. The community center was on higher ground. She had walked that route 100 times. She knew which streets ran uphill and which ones dipped low. If they stayed to the right side and kept moving, they had a chance. "I've got 2 flashlights in the kitchen drawer," Emily said, "and there's a backpack. I can fill it with some stuff." "I have diapers at my house." Sarah looked towards the door. "And formula. Noah hasn't eaten in 2 hours. Sarah, you can't go back. It's next door." Sarah's voice was firm, but not angry. "I'll be 30 seconds. Emily started to say something else, but Sarah was already moving. She pressed Noah into Emily's arms with a sudden, practiced motion, the kind that said she had handed him off to someone before, and trusted them to hold him right. "Just for a second," Sarah said. "Keep him against your chest. Support his head." Emily adjusted her grip. Noah was heavier than she expected, warm and solid and real. He looked up at her with big wet eyes, and his lower lip trembled. 30 seconds, Emily said. Sarah cracked the door open. Wind screamed through the gap. She pulled her jacket over her head and stepped out onto the porch, and the storm swallowed her almost immediately. Emily counted. She held Noah close and counted and watched the dark line of water spreading further across the kitchen floor. She got to 20. Then she heard it. A sound like a freight train, low and deep and building from somewhere up the street. The house shuddered. The windows rattled in their frames. Emily spun toward the front door just as a wall of brown water exploded through the neighborhood, tearing around the corner and slamming into everything in its path. The porch railing snapped away like a toothpick. Emily yanked the door open and screamed Sarah's name into the roaring dark. Sarah appeared out of nowhere, waist deep and fighting the current, her face twisted with panic. She reached the doorway and grabbed Emily's arm. "Take him." Sarah's voice was raw and desperate. She pressed her hands over Emily's, locking them around Noah. "Run to the shelter, don't stop. Please." Her eyes burned with something that went deeper than fear. "Save my baby." The current surged, and Sarah was gone. Emily stood in the doorway for one frozen second, staring at the place where Sarah had been. Then Noah cried. The sound cut right through her shock. She looked down at his face, scrunched and red and desperate, and something inside her clicked into place like a lock turning. She could not stay here. The water was already past the porch and pushing through the front door in a steady rush, cold and brown and smelling like mud and gasoline. In another few minutes, it would be knee-deep inside the house, and the current was getting stronger. She could feel it tugging at her ankles, even standing in the doorway. She had to move. She turned back inside and moved fast, splashing through the water already covering the kitchen floor. She grabbed the backpack from the hook beside the refrigerator and shoved 2 flashlights inside. She grabbed her phone from the counter. She found the fleece blanket her dad kept folded on the couch and wrapped it around Noah once, then twice, leaving only his face uncovered. He was still crying. She tucked him tight against her chest with her left arm and zipped her rain jacket around him as much as she could. Not perfect, but it would have to be enough. She found her boots by the back door and shoved her feet in without untying them first. Then she stepped off the porch and into the flood. The cold hit her like a slap. The water was thigh-high in the yard and moving sideways down the street with real force. Her first step sank into mud underneath and nearly pulled her shoe off. She caught herself against the porch post and steadied. Breathed. Took another step. "Okay," she whispered. To herself. To Noah. To nobody. "Okay." She held him up high with both arms and pushed forward through the current. Every step was a fight. The water shoved at her legs and grabbed at her knees and tried to spin her sideways. Debris floated past in the dark. A plastic trash can. A lawn chair tumbling end over end. A child's red bicycle barely visible under the surface. She screamed for help as she went. "Help! Somebody help me, please!" Her voice disappeared into the storm. The rain was so loud and so heavy that she could barely hear herself. She looked left and right as she moved, searching every window and rooftop and porch for any sign of another person. But the neighborhood looked abandoned. Every house was dark. Cars sat buried to their door handles. She kept moving. The street curved to the left ahead, and she knew that curve. She had ridden her bike around it 1,000 times. If she followed it and then cut through the parking lot behind the hardware store, she would come out on Maple Avenue. From there, it was straight up the hill to Birch Street and the community center. She told herself that. Over and over as she walked, like a map she was drawing in her head to keep her feet moving. Noah had stopped crying. That scared her more than the crying had. She tilted him back slightly and looked at his face. His eyes were open and blinking against the rain. She leaned forward so her jacket blocked some of it from hitting him directly. "Stay with me," she said. "You hear me? Stay with me." The current surged suddenly, and her right foot slipped off an invisible curb beneath the water. She went down to one knee. The cold rushed up to her waist and she gasped, lifting Noah above her head with both hands, her arms shaking with the effort. She pushed herself back up, got her feet under her, stood. She was soaked through. Her whole body was shaking, but she was standing. She kept going. By the time she reached the intersection at Maple and 3rd, the water was up to her hips and still climbing. She stopped at the corner and looked up the long hill ahead of her. Through the driving rain and the darkness, she could just barely see it. Pale yellow light glowing in the distance through the windows of the community center. The shelter. She could see it. The water rose another inch around her waist. The light from the shelter felt like a promise. Emily fixed her eyes on it and kept walking. The sky had gone from gray to deep purple. Evening was coming fast. What little daylight remained was disappearing behind thick clouds that sat low over the rooftops like a heavy wool blanket. The rain had not slowed. If anything, it was falling harder now, coming down in thick sheets that blurred everything more than 10 feet ahead of her. She turned up Maple Avenue and leaned forward into the hill. The water was slightly shallower here, maybe mid-thigh, because the street sloped upward. That helped. Every inch she climbed meant slightly less water pressing against her legs. She focused on that. Just the inches. Just the next step. Noah made a small sound against her chest. Not quite a cry. More like a question. "I know," she said softly. "I know it's cold. I'm sorry." She adjusted the blanket around him with her free hand while keeping the other arm locked beneath him like a shelf. The fleece was soaked through now. It was not keeping him warm anymore, just keeping the rain from hitting his skin directly. She pressed him closer to her body, hoping her own warmth, whatever was left of it, would transfer to him somehow. Her teeth were chattering. She clenched her jaw to stop them and focused on the next step. A large branch floated by at knee height and clipped her leg. She stumbled sideways and caught herself against a parked car half buried in the water. The metal was ice cold under her palm. She steadied herself, checked Noah, and kept going. Debris was everywhere now. Pieces of fence, a doormat spinning slow circles in an eddy near someone's driveway, a plastic storage bin bouncing down the middle of the road. She watched all of it carefully, steering around what she could see and moving slowly so she could feel what she could not. She talked to Noah the whole time. She was not even sure why. Maybe it helped him. Maybe it just helped her. "We're almost there," she told him. "See that light up there? That's where we're going. There are warm blankets there, and dry clothes probably, and people, okay? We're going to get you there." He blinked at her. His eyes were dark and wide and completely trusting. She swallowed hard and looked back up the hill. She had covered maybe half the distance to Maple and Fifth when she heard it. A deep, rolling sound, like a drum being struck far away. She slowed and looked back down the street behind her. The water surged. It came fast, much faster than anything before it. A wall of muddy brown water rushing up from lower in town with a force that she felt before she heard it. It hit the backs of her legs and shoved her forward, and she had no time to brace. Her feet left the ground for one terrifying second, and she clutched Noah with both arms and twisted her body sideways to protect him as the current slammed her hard into something solid. The impact knocked the breath out of her. She grabbed whatever she had hit and held on. Her fingers found a side mirror. A truck. A big pickup truck with its bed just barely visible above the waterline, parked against the curb. The current was pressing her into the driver's side door with a force she could not fight. She tried to push away from it, and the water shoved her right back. She could not move forward. She could not move back. The current pinned her there like a hand pressing her flat against the door. Noah began to cry. Loud and frightened, his small voice cutting through the sound of the rain. Emily tried to answer him. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because she was crying, too. She did not even realize it at first. The tears just came, mixing with the rain on her face, and her whole body shook with something bigger than the cold. She pressed her cheek against the top of his wet head and held on to the truck and sobbed. Nobody was coming. The headlights came first. 2 pale beams cutting through the rain like slow, steady eyes opening in the dark. Then more behind them. 4, 6. 8 sets of lights moving in a careful line down the flooded street, each one following the same path as the one before it. Emily heard the engines before she could make out the shapes. A deep, low rumble that she felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. Different from the storm. Steadier. Deliberate. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and stared into the rain. Motorcycles. They were moving slowly, barely faster than walking speed, picking their way through the debris-filled water like they were reading the road with every inch of tire. The lead bike was the biggest of them. Wide handlebars, heavy frame. The rider was enormous, tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders that filled out a soaking wet leather jacket like a wall filling a door frame. Emily opened her mouth and screamed, "Help! Over here! Please, help!" Her voice cracked on the last word. She screamed again, louder, even though screaming meant letting go of the breath she had been holding, and the cold rushed into her lungs and made her gasp. The lead bike slowed. Stopped. The rider stood up from the seat and looked in her direction. Even from 30 feet away, she could see how big he was. Well over 6 feet. He had a buzz cut, gray at the sides, and a thick beard streaked with gray. His leather jacket had patches on it that she could not read from this distance. His arms were covered in tattoos that disappeared under his sleeves and reappeared on the backs of his hands. He looked like the kind of person her father had probably warned her about without ever actually meeting one. But he was already moving toward her. He said something to the riders behind him, one short sentence, and then he stepped off his bike into the floodwater without hesitating. Not carefully. Not slowly. He just stepped in, like the water was not even a consideration, and started moving toward her with long, powerful strides. The current that had pinned Emily against the truck for the last however many minutes barely seemed to affect him. He leaned into it and kept coming. "I got you," he called out. His voice was deep and rough like gravel, but it carried through the rain without effort. "Hold on, I got you." He reached her in less than 20 seconds. Up close, he was even bigger than he had looked from a distance. His face was lined and weathered, the face of a man who had spent a lot of years outside in hard weather. His eyes were the color of river water, a clear and steady gray, and they moved quickly from her face to the baby in her arms, and back again, with the calm focus of someone who had been in emergencies before. "You hurt?" he said. "No," Emily said. Her voice was shaking badly. "The baby. Please check the baby first." He placed one enormous, tattooed hand gently against Noah's back and leaned in close. Noah was still crying, but he was breathing. He was warm enough. He was okay. The man nodded once. "He's all right. Come on." He positioned himself between Emily and the current, blocking it with his body like a break wall, and suddenly the pressure against her legs dropped. He put one arm around her shoulders to steady her and guided her away from the truck and through the water toward the line of bikes waiting at the edge of the current. One of the other riders reached down and helped lift Noah while Jack steadied Emily up onto slightly higher ground. She stood there, shaking, rain streaming down her face, and watched the enormous biker turn back to scan the street for anyone else. He called back to her without turning around. "Shelter's 2 blocks up. My guys'll get you there." Emily looked at him, at the patches on his jacket, at the tattoos, at the hard, rough shape of him, standing in the middle of a flooded street, in the dark. He was nothing like what she expected. The Millfield Community Center sat on the highest ground in town. Someone had propped both front doors wide open, and warm yellow light spilled out into the rain like a welcome sign that nobody had thought to turn off. Jack walked Emily and Noah up the front steps himself. He carried Noah in the crook of one thick arm, while keeping his other hand at Emily's elbow because her legs were still shaking badly enough that she had stumbled twice on the way over. They stepped inside. The noise hit Emily first. Voices, crying children, the crackle of a battery-powered radio, the squeak of wet shoes on the gymnasium floor. Then the warmth hit her, and she nearly collapsed from the relief of it. The community center smelled like wet coats and coffee, and something warm being cooked in the back kitchen. Then the silence started spreading. It moved outward from the door in a wave, the way silence always does when something unexpected walks in. People turned to look. A woman holding a paper cup of coffee froze mid-sip. A man near the supply table stopped stacking canned goods and just stared. They were not looking at Emily. They were looking at Jack. His leather jacket was soaked through and clinging to his shoulders. The patches stood out clearly under the fluorescent lights. The large letters across his back, the skull imagery, the Hell's Angels bottom rocker. His tattoos ran all the way up his neck and the backs of both hands, dark ink against weathered skin. He was dripping water onto the gymnasium floor, and he was enormous. And he looked exactly like every rumor this town had probably ever told about men like him. A man near the far wall leaned over to his wife and whispered something. She pulled their child a little closer. Nobody approached. Emily felt it immediately, the shift in the room, the careful, sideways attention that was really suspicion wearing a quieter face. She looked up at Jack and saw that he felt it too. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. The practiced stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago not to react. Then a volunteer broke through the crowd with a Mylar blanket, and everything started moving again. "Oh, sweetie, come here," the woman said. She was short and round-faced, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she wrapped the blanket around Emily's shoulders without asking. Another volunteer appeared with a second blanket for Noah, and gently lifted him from Jack's arm. "Let me take him, honey," she said softly, and Noah went to her without much fuss because he was exhausted and warm, and past the point of caring who held him. Emily let them steer her toward a row of cots along the far wall. Someone pressed a cup of warm broth into her hands. Someone else knelt down to check the cuts on her arms. She answered their questions in a daze. Yes, she was okay. Yes, she had walked from Sycamore Street. Yes, the baby was fine. Then the first woman paused and looked at Noah, and then back at Emily with a gentle smile. "Is this your little brother?" The question landed in the middle of Emily's chest and sat there for a moment. She looked at Noah. He was wrapped in a dry blanket now, his dark eyes blinking slowly as another volunteer swayed him side to side. He looked peaceful. He looked safe. He looked like the most important 8 pounds she had ever carried in her life. "No," Emily said quietly. "He's not." The woman tilted her head. "His name is Noah," Emily said. "He lives next door to me. His mom, Sarah, she put him in my arms when the water came up too fast. She made me promise to get him here safe." She swallowed. "So I did." The woman stared at her. Then she looked at the volunteer next to her. Then back at Emily. "You carried a neighbor's baby through that flood?" she said. Emily nodded. She did not feel like a hero. She felt cold and tired and very small. But the room had gone quiet again, and this time it felt completely different. People began turning toward her. Someone started clapping, then someone else. The sound grew until it filled the whole gymnasium, and Emily sat on the edge of the cot with her hands wrapped around her cup of broth and felt every set of eyes on her like a kind of warmth she had never quite felt before. She turned to find Jack. He was already gone. The rain had not let up. Jack pulled his jacket tighter and walked back out into it without looking over his shoulder. The warmth of the community center faded behind him in about 4 steps. The cold came back fast. He found his motorcycle where he had left it, parked up on the curb at the edge of the parking lot where the water had not yet reached. 2 of his crew were still there, waiting. Big men with tired eyes and wet hair plastered to their foreheads. "You going back out?" asked the one called Denny. "Yeah," Jack said. "Sheriff's team is working the east side. Then we take the west." Nobody argued. That was the thing about riding with men who had seen hard nights before. They did not need long conversations. They just needed to know which direction to point. Jack kicked his engine over, and the convoy moved back into the dark. The west side of Millfield was older. Smaller houses built close together on narrow streets that had turned into shallow rivers. Jack went block by block, sweeping his headlight across front porches and second-floor windows, looking for anything that moved. On Birch Street, he found an elderly man named Harold, sitting on top of his car in his pajamas. The water was up to the door handles. Harold had lived in that house for 41 years, and he had refused to leave when the warnings came, because he did not think the water would actually get that high. He was shaking so hard his teeth were clicking together. Jack waded out to him without a word, helped him down off the roof of the car, and carried him to dry ground on his back while Denny held a flashlight. Harold kept apologizing the whole way. I'm sorry. I should have left earlier." "You're out now," Jack said. "That's what counts." On Maple Avenue, they found a young mother on her second-floor balcony with 3 kids under the age of 6. She had been up there for 2 hours, watching the water rise, calling 911 over and over and getting a busy signal every time. Her youngest was crying. Her oldest was trying very hard not to cry and mostly failing. Jack and 2 of his crew formed a chain and got all 4 of them out. The mother kept squeezing Jack's arm and saying, "Thank you," so many times that the words started blurring together. He just nodded and moved on. A dog was found swimming in circles near the park. Jack fished it out with both arms and deposited it, soaking and frantic, into the lap of its owner, who had been calling its name from a second-story window for the better part of an hour. The dog licked Jack's face exactly once before he set it down. It was the closest thing to a celebration he allowed himself all night. House by house, street by street. The hours dissolved into cold water and flashlight beams and the weight of people who needed carrying. Jack did not keep count. He never did. Keeping count felt like the wrong reason to do the work. By the time pale gray light began creeping up the edge of the sky, he had lost track of how many trips he had made. Back at the community center, the doors were still open and the lights were still burning. Through the long night, small groups of survivors had been trickling in from every corner of Millfield. Some came in rescue boats, some walked, some were carried. And many of them, when they sat down and got warm and finally had enough breath to speak, told the same story. A big man, leather jacket, tattoos everywhere, came out of nowhere and pulled us out. Emily sat on her cot with Noah sleeping beside her and listened to every word. An older woman 2 cots over described being lifted off her porch roof in the dark. A teenage boy talked about how a biker had waded into chest-deep water to reach his trapped grandmother. Emily pulled her blanket tighter. She looked toward the open doors where rain still fell in silver sheets against the black sky. She wondered where he was right now. The doors burst open just before midnight. Jack came through them like a wall moving. His jacket was soaked black. His boots left muddy prints across the dry floor. Both arms were full. He carried a stack of folded blankets under one arm and a canvas bag over the other shoulder that clinked and shifted with every step. A shelter volunteer rushed over to meet him. "Where did you find all this?" the woman asked, already reaching for the bag. "Hardware store on 5th had its front window busted out by debris," Jack said. "Owner was there trying to salvage what he could. Gave us everything that was still dry." He set the blankets down on a table near the door. "Medical kit came from the firehouse on Grant. Nobody was using it." The volunteer looked inside the bag, and her eyes went wide. Bandages, antiseptic, cold medicine, a blood pressure cuff still in its case. "This is incredible," she said quietly. Jack had already turned away. He moved through the shelter with his head down, scanning the rows of cots. He was looking for something, or someone, though his face gave nothing away. Emily spotted him before he spotted her. She stood up from her cot. "Hey," she said. He stopped. Turned. Something in his expression shifted when he saw her. Not a smile exactly, more like a small loosening around the eyes. "You still awake?" he said. "I couldn't sleep." She glanced down at Noah, who was curled on her cot with his tiny fist pressed against his cheek. "He finally went down about an hour ago." Jack looked at the baby for a moment. Then he pulled a dry blanket from under his arm and held it out to her. "Found some dry ones," he said. "Figured you could use it." Emily took it. The blanket was soft, and it was warm, in a way that made her eyes sting unexpectedly. She pressed the feeling back down and looked up at him. "Jack," she said. He waited. "I never actually said thank you." She pulled the blanket against her chest and held it there. "For pulling us out of the water? For carrying us? For all of it?" She shook her head a little. "I was so scared out there. I really thought that was it. I thought we were going to get swept away and nobody was going to find us until morning." Her voice dropped. Or maybe not even then. Jack was quiet for a second. "You weren't swept away," he said. "Because of you." He shook his head slowly. "Because you held on. I just showed up. You were already fighting." Emily looked at him. She wanted to argue, but the words did not quite come. He glanced toward the door. She could see he was already thinking about going back out. His jaw had that set look to it, like a man who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "I have to get back out there," he said. "I know." He reached down and picked up the empty canvas bag from where he had left it on the floor. He slung it over his shoulder. Then he stopped and looked at her one more time. "You carried that baby through a flood in the dark," he said. "You didn't put him down. You didn't quit. You kept moving even when you had nothing left." He held her gaze. "Most grown people I know wouldn't have done what you did tonight. You need to remember that." Emily did not know what to say. "You're stronger than you think you are," Jack said. "A whole lot stronger." Then he turned and walked back toward the doors. His boots left the same muddy prints going out as they had coming in. The rain swallowed him up almost immediately. Emily stood at the edge of the cot for a long moment. She looked down at Noah. She looked back at the doors. His words stayed right where he had left them, settling into a quiet place inside her chest that had been empty for a very long time. The announcement came just after 6 in the morning. A man in a yellow rain jacket stood at the front of the shelter near the supply tables. He had a clipboard in one hand and a radio clipped to his belt. His name tag said, "County Emergency Management," but most people were too tired and too scared to read it. They just watched his face. And his face was not reassuring. "We need everyone's attention, please," he said loudly. The shelter went quiet, fast. That kind of quiet that comes when people already sense bad news is coming, and they stop breathing just a little while they wait for it. We've received a report from engineers monitoring the Garner Creek levee approximately 4 miles upstream. He paused. The levee is showing signs of structural stress due to overnight water volume. At this time, we are classifying the situation as a developing concern. Someone near the back said, "What does that mean?" "It means there is a possibility," the man said carefully, "that the levee could be compromised. If that happens, we would see a secondary surge of water moving through the lower parts of Millfield." He looked around the room, including the area surrounding this shelter. The room broke open all at once, voices everywhere. A woman near Emily grabbed her daughter and pulled her close. An older man stood up from his cot and started asking questions that nobody was answering. A little boy started crying and could not explain why. But children always feel it when the adults around them are afraid. Emily held Noah tighter against her shoulder. He had woken up about an hour earlier, quiet and wide-eyed, looking around at the unfamiliar ceiling with that serious expression babies get when the world is still brand new and nothing makes sense yet. She had been walking him slowly up and down the aisle between cots, bouncing him gently, trying to keep him calm. Now she stood very still and listened. The emergency management man raised his voice above the noise. "We are taking precautionary measures. Volunteers are needed outside to help reinforce water barriers along the east wall of the building. We also need people inside to reorganize supplies and help manage families." He looked around the room again. "We are not in immediate danger, but we need to be prepared." Prepared. Emily turned the word over in her mind. She scanned the shelter. She could see the fear on people's faces. Some of them had already been through so much the night before. A grandmother 3 cots down had arrived in nothing but her nightgown and someone else's boots. A family of 5 near the far wall had lost their car, their house, and most of what they owned before sunrise yesterday. And now they were being told it might happen again. Noah reached up and grabbed a fistful of Emily's hair. She untangled his fingers gently and shifted him to her other arm. Jack appeared from near the back corner of the shelter. Emily did not know when he had come back in. He must have returned sometime in the early hours while she was dozing. He looked like he had not slept at all. His jacket was still damp at the shoulders, and there was a dark bruise forming along the left side of his jaw that had not been there the night before. He walked straight toward the man with the clipboard. "The east wall barriers," Jack said. "You need sandbags or physical reinforcement?" The man blinked. "Both, ideally." "Then point me at it." The man nodded slowly. "We have a crew assembling outside in 10 minutes. Jack turned to go, and then stopped when he heard Emily's voice. "I want to help too." Both men looked at her. She was still holding Noah. Her hair was tangled, and her sneakers were still stained from the floodwater, and there were dark circles under her eyes from a night of almost no sleep. But her chin was up, and her voice was steady. "I can't lift sandbags with him in my arms," she said, looking at Jack. "But I can organize supplies in here. I can help families. I know where everything is already." Jack looked at her for a moment. Then he gave her one small nod. "Then that's what you do," he said. The morning moved slowly at first. Emily started small. She found a stack of paper cups near the supply table and filled them with water from the large jugs volunteers had brought in. Then she walked row by row through the shelter, handing them out one by one. "Here you go," she said to an elderly man sitting alone on a cot, staring at the floor. He looked up at her like he had forgotten someone might speak kindly to him. He took the cup with both hands and said, "Thank you," twice. She kept moving. Noah rode on her hip like he had always been there. She had fashioned a kind of sling using a long strip of fabric from a donated blanket, knotting it carefully over her shoulder so her hands stayed free. He peered out at the shelter from his new vantage point with those wide, serious eyes, watching everything. Occasionally he made a small sound, sometimes a soft babble, sometimes just a contented sigh. People noticed him. People always notice babies. Something about their smallness, their complete trust in the world around them, pulls at something deep in the chest. "Oh my goodness," a woman said, reaching out to touch Noah's chubby hand. "Is he yours?" "I'm watching him for his mama," Emily said. "She got separated in the flood." The woman's face softened into something gentle and sad. "And you carried him all that way by yourself?" Emily just nodded and kept moving. But the story had already spread through the shelter the night before. Enough people knew. And as the morning went on, she started to feel it. Little looks, quiet smiles. A volunteer who pressed an extra granola bar into her hand without explanation. A teenage boy who offered to hold Noah for a few minutes so she could rest her arm. An older woman who caught her eye from across the room and mouthed the words, "God bless you." Emily was not used to being seen like that. It felt strange, warm and uncomfortable at the same time, like stepping into sunlight after being inside too long. She found 4 children huddled together under a folding table near the back wall. The oldest was maybe 7. The youngest was barely 3, sitting with her knees pulled up and her thumb in her mouth and her eyes very round and very frightened. Emily crouched down beside them. "Hey," she said softly, "what are your names?" Getting them to talk took a few minutes, but she was patient. She asked about their favorite cartoon characters. She let Noah grab the oldest boy's finger and watched the boy's whole face change when Noah squeezed it and refused to let go. By the time a shelter volunteer came to find the children and reunite them with their grandmother, all 4 of them were laughing. It was close to 10 in the morning when the argument started. Emily heard the voice first, loud and sharp, and carrying across the shelter the way voices do when someone wants to be heard by more than just the person they are talking to. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." She turned. A man in a pressed button-down shirt was standing near the entrance, talking to one of the shelter coordinators. He was maybe 50, with silver hair combed neatly to one side, and the kind of posture that said he was used to people listening to him. Emily recognized him vaguely. She thought his name was Greer. He owned the hardware store on Main Street and a few other buildings around town. "Those are Hell's Angels," Greer said firmly. "You're letting a motorcycle gang operate freely in this shelter, and nobody wants to talk about what that actually means." The coordinator looked uncomfortable. "Sir, Mr. Sullivan has been nothing but helpful since he arrived." "Today," Greer said. "Sure. But what about his record? What about who these people are when there isn't a camera watching?" He crossed his arms. "I don't want him near the families in here. I don't want him near the children." Emily was across the room. And then she wasn't. She was standing right behind Greer before she fully realized she had walked there. Noah was still on her hip. Her heart was hammering, but her voice came out clear. "That man saved my life last night." Greer turned around slowly. His eyebrows went up when he saw who was speaking. "He went into the floodwater," Emily said. "In the dark, in the middle of a storm, when nobody else did. He didn't ask me my name first. He didn't stop to wonder if I was worth it. He just came." The shelter had gone quiet around them. "He's been out there all night bringing people in," she continued. "I've watched him carry blankets and food and help people he doesn't even know, and he never once asked for a thank you." She looked straight at Greer. "So I don't know what you've heard about him, but I know what I saw, and what I saw was someone good." Greer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Around the shelter, nobody moved. A few people exchanged glances. The coordinator behind Greer had stopped looking uncomfortable and started looking at Emily with something closer to admiration. Emily had not planned any of that. She had not practiced it. She had not even known she was going to say it until the words were already out. Her cheeks felt hot, but she did not look away. The afternoon brought a quieter kind of dread. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle outside. Inside the shelter, people moved with the careful, tired energy of people who had not slept. Cots were pushed into rows. Volunteers passed out sandwiches wrapped in plastic. Someone had found a box of coloring books and crayons, and a group of small children sat cross-legged on the floor, pressing hard into the pages like color itself could fix something. Emily had handed Noah off to a kind, older woman named Mrs. Holt, who had declared herself his temporary grandmother the moment she laid eyes on him. Mrs. Holt smelled like lavender and spoke to Noah in a soft, sing-song voice that made him blink slowly and lean into her shoulder. Emily trusted her instantly. With Noah settled, Emily felt the worry she had been pushing down all morning rise back up. Her father had called yesterday. One short call. "Stay safe. I love you." That was it. Since then, nothing. She told herself it was fine. Phone lines were down. Radios were jammed. He was busy. He was a firefighter. This was exactly the kind of night he trained for. He was fine. But the voice in the back of her head was getting louder. She found one of the shelter coordinators, a woman named Deborah, near the communications table at the far end of the building. Deborah had a radio headset around her neck and a clipboard pressed against her chest, and the particular look of someone managing 10 things at once. "Excuse me," Emily said. "My dad is Walter Parker. He's a volunteer firefighter. Is there any way to check on his team?" Deborah looked up. Her expression was kind but careful. "We can try, hun. What station?" "Station 4. He went out with a rescue crew yesterday afternoon." Deborah nodded and moved to the radio. She exchanged a few crackling words with someone on the other end. Emily stood very still and watched her face. That was how she knew before Deborah said a single word. The coordinator's eyes shifted. Just slightly. Just for a second. But Emily caught it. "His team checked in around 9 last night," Deborah said. Her voice was steady and gentle, the way voices get when people are trying very hard to sound calm. "After that, we lost contact. The storm knocked out several relay points. We haven't been able to re-establish communication with them since." The floor felt unsteady beneath Emily's feet. "Lost contact?" she repeated. "It doesn't mean anything bad," Deborah said quickly. "It happens in situations like this. Equipment fails. Teams move out of range. It's very common during major flood events." Emily nodded. She said thank you. She walked away from the table. She kept her face still and her steps even, and she made it all the way through the shelter and out the side door before her legs stopped working properly. The air outside was cold and wet and gray. A narrow concrete overhang kept the worst of the drizzle off. Emily sank down onto the step and pressed her back against the wall and pulled her knees to her chest. Lost contact. She had spent the whole night holding herself together, holding Noah together, holding herself upright through the dark water and the cold and the fear and the noise. She had stood up in front of that entire room and spoken with a voice that did not shake. But this was her dad. The tears came hard and fast, the kind that hurt on the way out. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut and tried to breathe through it, but the breath kept hitching and catching, and her whole chest felt like it was caving in. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the heavy boots on the concrete step beside her. She only knew Jack was there when his big, steady presence filled the space next to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold afternoon air. He did not say anything right away. He just sat down beside her. And then, quietly, he said, "Tell me." So she did. All of it came out between ragged breaths. Her dad's call yesterday. The silence since. What Deborah said. Lost contact. She said those two words like they were the worst words she had ever heard, because right now they were. Jack listened without interrupting, without offering quick fixes, without telling her everything was definitely fine. He just listened until she was done. When she finished, the drizzle filled the silence for a moment. Then Jack leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked out at the gray sky. "Your dad," he said slowly, "went out into that storm to help people. Same as you did." He turned his head and looked at her directly. "That doesn't sound like a man who gives up easy." Emily wiped her face with her sleeve. "We're going to keep looking for him," Jack said. His voice was quiet but solid, the kind of voice that doesn't make promises it cannot keep. "You hear me? We don't stop looking." The sandbags were heavy. Emily had not expected that. She had seen people filling them on the news before, during hurricanes and river floods in other parts of the country. It had always looked manageable from a television screen. Up close, with her hands raw and her back aching and her arms burning from the weight, manageable was not the word she would have chosen. But she kept going. The levee sat about a quarter-mile from the shelter, along a low stretch of road where the floodwater had crept up and was pressing hard against the earthen bank. A line of volunteers worked in the drizzle, shoveling dirt and sand into burlap bags and stacking them in rows along the weak section. Emergency crew members directed the effort, moving up and down the line and checking the placement of each layer. Jack worked at the far end of the line, and Emily had positioned herself right beside him. Not because she was told to, because it was where she wanted to be. He worked with a kind of quiet efficiency that she noticed right away. No wasted movement, no complaining. His big hands grabbed the shovel, filled the bag, tied it off, passed it down the line, and started again. Over and over, like a machine that had done this 100 times before. Maybe he had. Emily grabbed another empty bag and held it open while a volunteer shoveled sand inside. Her fingers were numb from the cold. She switched the bag to her other hand and tried to get feeling back. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Jack glanced over without stopping his rhythm. "Go ahead." "How many times have you done something like this?" She gestured toward the levee, the bags, the whole muddy effort around them. "Disaster stuff. Helping people." He thought about it for a second. His shovel scraped against the ground. "Lost count," he said. She looked at him. "Really?" "Really." He tied off a bag and set it aside. "Started about 15 years ago, after Maria died." Emily went quiet. She had not heard that name before, but the way he said it told her everything she needed to know about what that name meant to him. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded once. 17 years together." He grabbed another empty bag. "She got sick. It happened fast. 1 year she was fine, next year she was gone." He was quiet for a moment. House felt real empty after that. Emily did not say she was sorry. She had heard that phrase 1,000 times after her own mom died, and it never quite fit the size of the hole it was supposed to fill. She just listened, the way Jack had listened to her earlier. "I didn't know what to do with myself," he continued. "Riding helped some. Being around the guys helped some, but it wasn't enough. He stacked another bag onto the row. Then a big flood hit a town about 200 miles from where I was living. Bad one. I drove through and just started helping. Didn't plan it, didn't think about it, just started pulling people out of their houses. He paused. Felt like the first useful thing I'd done in a year. So you kept doing it, Emily said. Every time I heard about something. Floods, tornadoes, wildfires. He shrugged his big shoulders. I'm not a doctor, not an engineer, but I can carry things. I can drive into bad weather. I can pull people out of water. He looked at her sideways. Turns out that's enough. Emily held open another bag and thought about that. About how a man with a broken heart had turned his grief into something that saved lives. Did it help? She asked. Doing all of it. Did it help with missing her? Jack was quiet for a long moment. His breath made a small cloud in the cold evening air. It helped me remember that life still had a point, he said. That was enough. An hour later, Emily walked back to the shelter alone. The drizzle was soft against her face. She tucked her hands into her pockets and thought about what Jack had said. She thought about it for a long time. Tuesday night settled over Millfield, like a heavy blanket. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but the air still carried that cold, damp bite that crept through jackets and settled in bones. Inside the shelter, generators hummed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Cots lined the gymnasium floor in long rows, and the smell of coffee and wet clothing hung in the air. Outside, near the levee, the work continued. Jack was back at it. He had barely rested. His shoulders rolled under the weight of each sandbag like it was nothing, like exhaustion was something that happened to other people. Mud covered his boots up to the ankle. His leather jacket was dark with water. What was different tonight was who was working beside him. Earlier that day, most volunteers had kept their distance. They stacked bags on their side of the line and let Jack work on his. There were sideways glances, quiet whispers, a few people who made a point of moving away when he stepped near. But something had shifted. It started with a man named Ray Hodges. Ray was a plumber. Big guy, thick arms, baseball cap pulled low. He had been one of the loudest voices earlier in the week, grumbling about the biker near the supply table, questioning whether someone with a Hells Angels patch should be trusted around children. Ray's next-door neighbor had been one of the families Jack rescued during the night before. An older couple who would not have made it out without him. So Ray walked over and picked up a shovel and started working right beside Jack without saying a word. Jack did not make a thing of it. He just nodded and kept going. Within the hour, 3 more volunteers joined that end of the line. A young woman named Carla who had lost her apartment to flooding. A retired teacher named Mr. Fenn who had been helping organize cots inside but had come out to do more. A teenager about Emily's age named Marcus who had been watching Jack all evening with wide, curious eyes before finally deciding that watching was not enough. They worked. All of them. Together. The conversation was slow at first. Short words, practical words. Pass that one. Watch your footing there. How many more rows do we need? But gradually it loosened into something more natural. Ray told a story about a flood that hit his neighborhood when he was a kid. Carla laughed at something Mr. Fenn said about his boots leaking. Marcus asked Jack a question about the motorcycle parked near the road, and Jack gave a real answer, a detailed one, the kind a person gives when they actually enjoy talking about something. And just like that, the distance was gone. Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived at the levee site just before 9 in the evening. He was 60 years old, broad across the chest, with a gray mustache and the kind of steady eyes that had seen most things twice. He walked the length of the line slowly, nodding at volunteers, checking the barrier progress with the engineers. Then he stopped in front of Jack. The two men looked at each other. There had been a wariness between them since Jack first arrived at the shelter. Nothing spoken out loud, just the particular kind of tension that lives between a lawman and someone carrying a reputation. The sheriff extended his hand. "Sullivan," he said, "I've been hearing your name all night, from people you pulled out of their houses, from families you got to the shelter." He paused. "I wanted to say it to your face. This town owes you." Jack shook his hand. "I didn't do anything anyone else wouldn't do." "Maybe," the sheriff said. "But you did it first." He held the handshake a moment longer, and then moved on down the line. Jack turned back to his work. But Emily, who had come outside with a thermos of coffee for the volunteers, had seen the whole thing. She stood near the edge of the light and felt something warm move through her chest. Back inside the shelter, Noah was awake. He had been fussy earlier, but now he sat propped against a folded blanket on a cot near the center of the room, his dark eyes wide and curious, watching everything around him with that particular kind of attention that babies have. Like the whole world is brand new and worth examining closely, which, for him, it was. A woman named Gloria, who had lost her home that morning and had barely spoken since arriving, was sitting on the edge of the cot beside him. She was holding out her finger, and Noah was gripping it in his small fist and studying it with great seriousness. Gloria was smiling. It was the first time anyone had seen her smile since she walked through the shelter door. Word passed quietly through the room. People drifted over. Not in a crowd, but one at a time, the way people approach something gentle. A man named Doug pulled up a folding chair. A pair of sisters sat cross-legged on the floor nearby. Old Mr. Fenn, just back from the levee, stood at the edge of the small gathering and watched with tired, kind eyes. Noah looked around at all of them and let out a small sound. Not a cry, something closer to a greeting. A few people laughed softly. And just like that, the gymnasium felt a little less like a place where people were waiting for something bad to happen. It felt like a place where people were together. Wednesday arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic shift in the sky, no golden light breaking through clouds. Just a slow, gray brightening that crept through the shelter's high windows and settled over the rows of sleeping cots like a quiet exhale. Emily had not slept much. She had dozed for maybe 2 hours, sitting upright in a folding chair with Noah asleep against her chest. Her neck ached. Her feet were still sore from 2 days of walking through floodwater. But every time she closed her eyes all the way, her mind filled with images of her father. His voice on the phone, calm and steady, telling her to stay safe. The moment the radio contact went silent. The way the emergency coordinator had looked at the floor when she asked for an update. She kept her eyes open instead. Around 5 in the morning, a small group of engineers came through the shelter doors. They looked exhausted, but there was something different in the way they carried themselves. Lighter, maybe, less tight around the shoulders. One of them, a tall woman with a yellow safety vest and mud on her forearms, spoke briefly with Sheriff Brooks near the entrance. Emily watched from across the room. She could not hear the words, but she saw the sheriff nod. Slowly at first, then with more certainty. He turned towards the shelter and raised his voice enough to carry. "Levee is holding," he said. "Engineers say the reinforcement is working. We're not out of trouble yet, but we're in better shape than we were 6 hours ago." A ripple of relief moved through the room. A few people clapped. Someone near the back said something that made the people around them laugh quietly. Jack was standing near the supply tables with a cup of coffee. He heard the news and gave a single nod, the kind that meant he believed it, but was not ready to celebrate yet. He caught Emily's eye from across the room and gave her the same nod. She returned it. Outside, the drizzle had stopped for the first time in 2 days. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the ground was no longer drinking water it could not hold. Search teams had been moving since before dawn, working through neighborhoods where flood levels had dropped enough to navigate safely. They moved in pairs, checking houses, calling out, marking doors with colored tags that meant different things. Emily knew her father was somewhere in that system. She knew people were looking. She had been told this multiple times, by the sheriff, by a volunteer coordinator named Pam, by Jack himself. Knowing did not make the waiting easier. She fed Noah a bottle from the supplies the shelter had gathered, holding him the way she had learned over the past 2 days, his head resting in the crook of her arm, his small hands curling and uncurling around nothing. He watched her face while he ate, the way he always did, like she was the most interesting thing in the room. "Your mom is coming," she told him quietly. "She's okay. They're going to find her." She said it for herself as much as for him. At 7:30, Pam appeared at Emily's side. Pam was a short woman with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had been coordinating family reunifications since the shelter opened and had delivered both good news and hard news over the past 2 days. Emily had learned to read her face before she even spoke. This time Pam was smiling. "Emily," she put a hand on her shoulder. "They found your dad." Emily went very still. "He's okay," Pam said quickly. "He got cut off from his team during the night, took shelter in a school building on the east side. Search team reached him about 40 minutes ago. He's got a sprained ankle and they said he's pretty banged up, but he's talking and he's stable." She squeezed Emily's shoulder. "They're bringing him here now." The sound that came out of Emily was not quite a word. It was something smaller and larger than that at the same time. Noah looked up at her face and blinked. Emily stood near the shelter entrance for a long time. She had tried to sit down twice. Both times she ended up back on her feet, drifting toward the double doors like something was pulling her there. Noah rode against her hip, his small fist curled around the collar of her shirt. He seemed content. She was anything but. The morning had stretched into afternoon slowly, the way mornings do when you are watching for something. People moved around her. Volunteers handed out lunch. Someone had found a radio and was playing soft music in the corner near the cots. The sounds of the shelter went on like background noise she could not quite focus on. Then the doors opened. 2 rescue workers came through first, still wearing their bright orange gear and muddy boots. Behind them came a man on crutches, moving slowly, one ankle wrapped thick with a bandage. His face was scraped along the left cheek. His volunteer firefighter jacket was torn at the sleeve. His hair was matted and damp, but his eyes found her immediately. "Dad?" Emily did not remember crossing the room. One moment she was standing near the wall, and the next she was in front of him with Noah still on her hip. And Walter Parker was wrapping his free arm around both of them, leaning into the embrace with his whole weight, like he had been holding himself up through sheer stubbornness until this exact moment. He pressed his face against the top of her head. "M." His voice broke on the single syllable. He said it again anyway. "M." She could not speak. She just held on. Noah, squeezed gently between them, made a small, surprised sound and then settled, one hand patting Walter's chest like he was checking to make sure the man was real. Around them, the shelter went quiet first, then loud. Someone started clapping near the supply tables. The sound spread fast, moving through the room the way warmth moves through a cold space, filling the corners. People stood from their cots. Volunteers stopped what they were doing. A woman near the back was crying, which set off the man beside her, which set off several others. Sheriff Brooks stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight in that way he had, but his eyes were bright. Jack watched from near the far wall. He had a sandbag-dusted jacket over his arm and a cup of coffee in his hand. He did not clap, but he was smiling, which on his face was its own kind of celebration. Walter pulled back just far enough to look at Emily. He took in the cuts on her hands, the bruise along her forearm, the shadows under her eyes that came from 2 days of barely sleeping. Then he looked at the baby she was holding. "Is this Noah?" he asked. "Yeah," Emily said. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something deep and quiet that he did not have the words for yet. He reached out and put his hand against her face. "I heard what you did," he said. She shook her head. "I just kept walking." "I know," he said softly. "That's what I heard." They sat together for the rest of the afternoon. The three of them, Emily and her father and the baby who had brought them to this place, in ways none of them fully understood yet. Walter drank 2 cups of coffee and ate whatever the volunteers put in front of him. Emily stayed close enough to touch his arm when the conversation paused. At 4:15, the engineer in the yellow vest stepped to the center of the shelter floor and raised her voice above the quiet noise of the room. "We've just received confirmation from the upstream monitoring stations," she said. "The levee is fully stabilized. Water levels are receding across all major points. The threat to this shelter is over." For one breath, nobody moved. Then the room came apart in the best possible way. People cheered. Someone whooped from the back corner. Children who had been frightened for 2 days started laughing because the adults around them were laughing. Emily reached for her father's hand and held it tight. The celebration did not last long. It never does when there is still work to be done. By early evening, the mood inside the shelter had shifted from relief back into the steady, tired rhythm of people who knew the flood was receding, but had not yet finished its damage. Water still sat deep in the lower neighborhoods. Several families remained unreachable. A radio report confirmed that a cluster of homes near the east side of town had been completely cut off since Monday night. No food, no medicine, no contact. Sheriff Brooks spread a map across the folding table near the entrance and pressed his finger against a spot marked in red. "We have 4 households confirmed isolated here," he said. 2 elderly residents with medical needs. 1 family with a diabetic child who ran out of insulin yesterday morning. He looked up at the small group gathered around the table. "We have supplies loaded and a flat-bottom rescue boat ready. What we need are people willing to get in it." 2 rescue workers raised their hands without hesitating. Jack stepped forward from the back of the group. The sheriff glanced at him briefly. Something passed across his face, not suspicion exactly, more like the last thin layer of it finally wearing away. He gave a single nod. "We leave in 20 minutes, he said. Emily watched Jack pull on a dry jacket near the supply tables. She had Noah against her shoulder, patting his back in slow circles the way she had learned kept him calm. "You just got back," she said. Jack zipped the jacket and checked the straps on the gear vest one of the rescue workers had handed him. "Still light enough to navigate the East Channel if we move now? Couple hours from now it won't be." "You should eat something first." He looked at her sideways. A small smile crossed his face. "You sound like somebody's parent." She handed him a wrapped sandwich from the supply table without saying anything else. He took it. He ate half of it standing there, which she decided counted. Walter appeared beside her, moving carefully on his crutches. He watched Jack for a moment, then looked at his daughter. "He's going back out?" Walter asked quietly. "He is," Emily said. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good man." It was simple, just 2 words. But Emily saw Jack's shoulders shift slightly, the way a person moves when something lands on them that they were not expecting to feel. The rescue boat was a flat-bottomed aluminum vessel, wide enough for 5 people and a load of supplies. It sat at the edge of what used to be Garner Street, where the pavement dropped off sharply into brown, moving water. 2 large plastic containers of medical supplies were already secured to the center. Life vests were passed around and fastened. The sky above Millfield had gone the color of a bruise, purple and gray and heavy. The rain had slowed to a light mist, but the air still felt full of water, like the whole world was wet down to its bones. Jack stepped into the boat and settled at the front. One of the rescue workers, a broad young man named Trey, took the motor at the back. The second worker, a woman named Patrice, sat in the middle beside the supply containers with a flashlight and a radio. Trey pulled the motor cord, and the engine sputtered, then caught, filling the quiet street with a low mechanical rumble. They pushed off. The current grabbed the boat almost immediately, nudging it sideways before Trey corrected their direction. The water moved with a restless, heavy energy beneath them, the kind that reminded you it had its own plans. Debris drifted past in the beam of Patrice's flashlight. A lawn chair, a child's plastic slide, the top half of a wooden fence still holding its shape. They moved east for nearly 15 minutes without speaking. Then Patrice's radio crackled. "We have visual on the Garner East households," the voice said. "Be advised, the channel narrows ahead. Current is stronger than estimated. Approach with extreme caution." Trey cut the engine slightly. Jack leaned forward and looked at the water ahead. The channel between 2 rows of half-submerged houses was tight, maybe 12 feet across. The water moved through it fast and loud, churning white at the edges where it met the walls. And there, clinging to a second-floor window frame of the nearest house, were 2 people waving their arms in the beam of the flashlight. "There," Jack said. Trey steered toward them. The current hit them hard. The current slammed into the side of the boat like a hand pushing hard against it. Trey gunned the motor to compensate. The bow swung back into alignment, and they pushed forward through the narrow channel, engine growling against the force of the water. Jack braced himself against the front edge of the boat and kept his eyes on the window. A woman gripped the frame with both hands. Beside her, pressed against the glass, was a young girl maybe 6 or 7 years old. The woman's face was pale and tight with fear, but she was not screaming. She was holding herself together the same way people do when they have been scared for so long that screaming stopped feeling useful. "We're coming," Jack called out over the current. "Hold on." They got the boat alongside the second-floor window ledge. Patrice grabbed the window frame to hold them steady, while Trey kept the engine running just enough to fight the push of the water. Jack reached up. "Hand her to me first," he said to the woman, nodding toward the child. The woman hesitated for only a second. Then she lifted the girl and passed her through the open window into Jack's arms. He brought her down into the boat carefully, one hand behind her back, one under her legs. He set her in the center beside Patrice, who immediately wrapped a blanket around her narrow shoulders. Then came the woman. She was heavier and shaking, and the ledge was slick, and for one bad moment her foot slipped on the wet wood. Jack caught her wrist with both hands and held on until she found her footing again. He lowered her into the boat without letting go until she was seated. "You're okay," he said. "You're in." The woman covered her face with her hands and let out a long, shaking breath. They moved to the next house. The diabetic boy was 8 years old and very quiet. His parents had kept him calm through 2 days of flooding by playing card games and telling stories, which Jack learned because the father told him immediately upon seeing the boat, words spilling out in a rush of gratitude and exhaustion. Jack helped the family into the boat one by one, while Patrice checked the boy's condition and located the insulin in the supply containers. The boy watched Jack with wide, serious eyes. "Are you a real biker?" the boy asked. "I am," Jack said. "Do you have a motorcycle?" "Back in town. She's parked on high ground." The boy seemed satisfied with that. He leaned against his mother and let Patrice do her work without complaint. They turned the boat back west toward the shelter. The elderly residents were the final stop. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, 73 and 78 years old. They lived in a single-story house near the edge of the East Channel, which meant the water had reached their roof line by Tuesday morning. They had been on the roof ever since. A passing rescue team had radioed their location, but could not reach them due to the narrowing channel and the stronger current on that far end. The Caldwells were sitting in lawn chairs on the ridge of their roof when the boat arrived. Mrs. Caldwell was wrapped in a rain slicker and had somehow managed to keep a small bag of belongings with her. Mr. Caldwell had a bandage wrapped around his left forearm, dark with dried blood, where he had caught himself on a broken shingle. Jack stood in the front of the boat as Trey maneuvered them as close as the current would allow. The channel here was even tighter. The water moved with a low, heavy roar that made conversation difficult. "We're going to need you to come down the slope a little," Jack called up to them. "I'll catch you." Mr. Caldwell helped his wife to the edge first. Jack reached up and guided her down the slope of the roof and into the boat. Then the old man began his descent. He moved slowly. His shoes were wet and the roof was steep, and his legs were stiff from 2 days of sitting. Halfway down, his foot slid. Jack lunged forward to catch him. The shift in weight rocked the boat hard to the left. Beneath the surface, a massive section of submerged fence post swung through the current and drove into the underside of the hull with a deep, hollow crack. The impact threw the front of the boat upward. Jack went over the side. The water took him instantly. No struggle, no cry. Just one moment he was there, reaching for the old man, and the next, the current had him, and the dark brown water closed over his head, and he was gone. Trey cut the engine and screamed his name. Patrice grabbed the rescue line from the supply bag and threw it into the water where he had been. The rope floated on the surface. Nothing pulled it back. The news reached the shelter in pieces. First came Trey, soaking wet and breathing hard, his boots leaving dark tracks across the gymnasium floor. He went straight to the emergency coordinator's table near the back wall. Emily watched him from across the room. She could not hear the words, but she could read his face well enough. Something had gone wrong. She set Noah down on the folded blanket beside her father and crossed the floor. By the time she reached the table, Sheriff Brooks was already there. He had one hand pressed flat on the surface, and his jaw was set in a hard line. Trey was talking fast, gesturing with both hands, and the emergency coordinator, a woman named Diane, was already reaching for her radio. Emily stopped a few feet away. "Jack," she said. It was not a question. Trey looked at her. The regret in his eyes confirmed it before he said a single word. He went in trying to catch an elderly gentleman on a rooftop. Current took him. We threw a line, but he was already under. Patrice and I followed the channel for 20 minutes in the boat before visibility got too low. He stopped, swallowed. We couldn't find him. The room had not gone quiet yet. People were still moving around them, still carrying trays and folding cots and talking in low voices. Life in the shelter continued the way it always does, unaware and unhurried, while Emily stood in the middle of all of it, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under her feet. She walked back to her father. Walter looked up from the cot the moment he saw her face. "Emily." She sat down beside him and pressed her lips together hard, and did not speak for a moment because she knew if she tried to speak, the words would break apart before they reached the air. "Jack's missing," she finally said. "In the water." Walter put his arm around her without a word. Noah had fallen asleep on the blanket. His small chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. He had no idea what was happening. He simply slept, one tiny fist curled near his chin, peaceful in the middle of everything. Emily stared at him and tried to hold herself together. She thought about the way Jack had said she was stronger than she knew. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the dark beside the sandbags, not like she was just a kid, but like she was somebody worth talking to, somebody worth listening to. She thought about a man who had spent decades helping strangers and never asked anyone to remember his name. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed slowly through her nose. Walter held her tighter. Around them, word continued to spread. She could hear it moving across the shelter in murmurs. The businessman who had criticized Jack earlier that morning sat at a table near the far wall. He said nothing now. He just stared at the floor with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Even the sheriff looked shaken. Rescue teams coordinated a search along the downstream channel. Boats went out despite the darkness. Flashlights swept the water. Radio updates came in short and infrequent, and each one that reported nothing was its own kind of weight. The hours moved slowly. Emily did not sleep. It was past 2 a.m. when Diane's radio crackled to life with something different in the dispatcher's voice. "We've got him. Downstream about a quarter-mile past the old grain elevator. He's unconscious. Breathing. We're moving him now." Emily stood up so fast her knees nearly buckled. Walter caught her arm. The rescue team had pulled Jack from a tangle of debris lodged against the support columns of a collapsed equipment shed. He had been pinned there by the current, held above the waterline by less than a foot. His pulse was faint but steady. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the temporary medical center set up in the old community center on Franklin Street. He was alive, but just barely. Thursday came in quietly. The rain had finally stopped sometime before dawn. Emily noticed it the way you notice silence after a long noise. It was the absence of something that had been constant for so long it had started to feel permanent. Outside the narrow windows of the community center, the sky was turning from black to gray. Pale and flat, but dry. The kind of sky that said the worst was finished, even if the damage was not. The floodwater was still there. It covered the lower streets and sat heavy against the sides of buildings. But it was no longer rising. It lay still and exhausted, like something that had finally run out of fight. Emily had not left the medical center. She sat in a plastic chair beside Jack's cot, her knees pulled up to her chest, and her arms wrapped around them. A thin hospital blanket had been draped over her shoulders by one of the nurses sometime during the night. She did not remember that happening. She had drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep that was more like blinking than resting. Her father had stayed with her until midnight, and then gone back to the shelter to watch over Noah. He had squeezed her hand before he left. "Come get me if anything changes," he said. She had nodded. She had not moved since. Jack lay on the cot with an oxygen tube under his nose and a bandage wrapped around his left shoulder and down across his ribs. "Dr. Nguyen, A compact woman with dark hair pulled back tight had explained the injuries in careful language. 2 cracked ribs. A deep laceration on his shoulder from the debris. A mild concussion from striking something hard underwater. Possible hypothermia. Possible, she had said, but he was responding well to warming measures. His temperature was climbing back toward normal. He was stable. That was the word she kept using. Stable. Emily had decided she liked that word more than almost any other word in the English language. She watched his chest rise and fall. She watched the slow tick of the monitor beside the cot. She listened to the soft movements of the nurses doing their rounds and the distant hum of the generator keeping the lights on. Outside, somewhere down the street, she heard a rescue crew calling out to one another as they moved through the receding water. Voices carrying through the still morning air. She thought about how many times Jack had been one of those voices in the dark. How many times he had waded into something terrible because he looked at a dangerous situation and saw a person inside it who needed help. She thought about how he had never once asked for anything in return. Her eyes burned. She blinked and looked at the ceiling for a moment before looking back at him. She was still watching when his hand shifted. It was a small movement, just his fingers, curling slightly against the blanket. Then his jaw tightened. Then his brow drew together in a slow, heavy frown. Emily sat up straight. His eyes opened. They were glassy at first and unfocused, taking in the ceiling above him with the careful, deliberate effort of someone climbing back from somewhere very far away. Then they found her face. His voice came out low and rough, worn down to almost nothing. "Kid." "I'm here," Emily said. Her voice cracked on both words. He blinked twice, slow and heavy. He looked around the room. He took in the cots, the monitors, the medical supplies stacked along the wall. Then he looked back at her. "The pregnant woman," he said. "Did she make it?" Emily let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "She's fine," she said. "She's safe. Everyone from the boat is safe." Jack closed his eyes again. The tension in his face eased. His shoulders dropped just slightly against the pillow, the way a person's whole body relaxes when they hear the one thing they needed to hear. He had just woken up from nearly drowning. And the very first thing he thought about was someone else. Friday morning arrived with something Millfield had not felt in days. Stillness. Not the heavy, threatening stillness that had hung over the town before the storm. This was different. This was the stillness of something finished. The sky was pale blue and clear. Thin white clouds stretched out across it like they had been pulled by careful hands. The sun was low and soft, casting long golden light across the waterlogged streets. The floodwater was retreating slowly. It pulled back from doorways and sidewalks and front yards, leaving behind a thick layer of mud, debris, and the ruins of ordinary life. Shoes, toys, waterlogged furniture, a child's bicycle tangled against a stop sign. Things that had once been normal, now scattered and broken across the town like proof of what had happened here. Cleanup crews moved through the streets in orange vests and rubber boots. Volunteers worked beside them. People who had lost their own homes were helping their neighbors pull wreckage off porches and shovel mud out of entryways. There was very little talking. Just the sound of shovels and boots and the occasional roar of a pump clearing water from a basement. The emergency shelter was still active. People whose homes were unlivable stayed there. Hot meals were still being served. Cots were still full. But the mood had shifted. The terror had passed. What remained now was the long, quiet work of putting things back together. Emily sat at a folding table near the shelter entrance with a clipboard in her hands. She was helping track the names of residents who had checked in, checked out, or were still listed as unaccounted for. Her father had suggested it. Something useful. Something to keep her hands busy while her mind did what it could not stop doing. There were still names on the missing list. One of them was Sarah Bennett. Emily looked at that name every time she flipped to the second page. She looked at it longer than she looked at any other name. She thought about Sarah's face in the dark, the rain soaking through her clothes, the way her hands had shaken when she pressed Noah into Emily's arms. Please save him. Noah was safe. He was asleep on a cot 3 rows back, curled against a stuffed bear that a volunteer had brought in from a donation box. He was warm and fed and fine. Emily had made sure of that. Walter had made sure of that. But Sarah did not know any of it yet. She did not know her son was safe. She did not know what Emily had carried him through. She did not know anything except whatever fear had been sitting with her since the moment the floodwater tore them apart. Emily could not stop thinking about that. At 9:30, a heavy-set man named Officer Crane came through the shelter's front doors, moving with purpose. He had a radio clipped to his shoulder and a clipboard of his own tucked under his arm. He had been part of the team coordinating the search for missing residents since Wednesday. He found the shelter coordinator, a tall woman named Mrs. Delgado, and spoke to her quietly near the entrance. Emily watched their faces. Mrs. Delgado's hand went to her mouth. Then she nodded quickly and turned and looked across the room until her eyes landed on Emily. She walked over fast. "Emily." Her voice was warm and careful at the same time. "They found her." Emily stood up. The clipboard slipped from her hands, and she did not notice. "Sarah Bennett was located at the Hargrove County Evacuation Center early this morning," Mrs. Delgado said. "She's alive. She's being treated for minor injuries, but she is stable, and she is asking about Noah." Emily's throat closed completely. Mrs. Delgado kept talking. She was saying something about transport arrangements and an estimated arrival time, and whether Noah had enough formula. Emily heard the words, but they moved slowly through her, like they were traveling a great distance before reaching her. Sarah was alive. She was coming back. Noah was about to have his mother again. Saturday morning came in golden and gentle. The shelter smelled like coffee and clean blankets and something warm being cooked in the back kitchen. People moved quietly through the wide room, talking in low voices, helping each other fold cots and sort through donation boxes. There was still tiredness in every face, but there was also something else now. A looseness, a relief that had settled into people's shoulders and softened their eyes. Emily had barely slept. She sat on the edge of her cot with Noah in her lap, feeding him from a small bottle. He wrapped both hands around her fingers the way he always did when he drank, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. His dark eyes watched her face with total calm. He trusted her completely. He always had, even when she had not trusted herself. "Not much longer now, little guy," she whispered. Noah blinked slowly and kept drinking. Walter sat in a chair beside her, a paper cup of coffee warming his hands. He looked like a man who had been through something serious and knew it. There were still dark circles under his eyes and a healing cut along his left jaw. But he was there, solid and present and hers. He had not stopped checking on her every hour since he arrived at the shelter 2 days ago. He reached over and rested a hand briefly on her shoulder. She leaned into it, just slightly. At 10:15, the shelter doors opened. A small group of people came in from outside. 2 of them were medical volunteers in blue vests. Between them walked a woman in borrowed clothes, a gray sweatshirt too large for her frame, and dark sweatpants still damp at the hem. Her brown hair was pulled back roughly. There was a bandage wrapped around her left forearm and a bruise fading yellow along her cheekbone. But her eyes were moving fast, searching. Sarah Bennett stepped into the room and looked around with the desperate, focused energy of someone who had been waiting to do this exact thing for 4 days. Emily stood up. "Sarah." Her voice came out thin and high, not at all how she had planned it. Sarah's eyes found her immediately. Then they dropped to Noah. The sound that came out of Sarah was not quite a word. It was something deeper than a word. She crossed the room quickly, almost stumbling, and Emily stepped forward and placed Noah into his mother's arms. Sarah pulled him against her chest. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, and her whole body shook. She held him the way people hold things they thought they had lost forever. Tight, careful, like she was still not quite sure it was real. Noah made a small surprised sound, and then went still. One tiny hand found the collar of her sweatshirt and held on. The room had gone quiet without anyone deciding to make it quiet. People stopped folding, stopped sorting, stopped talking. They just watched. Some of them had been in the shelter since Monday night. They knew what Noah represented. They had taken turns holding him and singing to him and laughing when he laughed. He belonged to all of them in some small way now, but he had always belonged to her. A woman near the back began to cry. Then someone else did. Then someone started clapping, softly at first. And then the whole room joined in, not a loud celebration, something quieter than that, something honest. Walter put his arm around Emily's shoulders, and she let herself cry, too, openly and without embarrassment, because some things deserved tears. Sarah lifted her head. Her face was wet, and her eyes were red, but she was smiling. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere so deep it almost looks like pain. She looked at Emily. "You saved him." Emily shook her head. "I just carried him." "That was everything," Sarah said. The clapping faded slowly into murmuring and movement as people returned to what they had been doing, warmed through in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee or the morning sun coming through the high windows. Sarah stood holding Noah close, swaying gently the way mothers do without thinking about it. Her eyes moved around the room with quiet gratitude, taking in the faces of strangers who had become something more than strangers. They traveled past the cots and the folding tables and the donation boxes stacked along the far wall. And then they stopped. Across the room, sitting alone on a metal chair near the side exit, was a large man. He was broad through the shoulders, heavily built, with a buzz cut and a gray streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor, a paper cup held loosely between his big hands. Sarah went very still. The color left her face. Her arms tightened around Noah without her seeming to realize it. She stared at the man across the room, and something moved behind her eyes. Something old. Something that had been stored somewhere deep and untouched for a very long time. Her lips parted slightly. She knew that face. Emily watched Sarah's face change. It happened slowly, the way a memory surfaces. First the stillness, then the recognition, then something that looked almost like disbelief, mixing with certainty all at once. Sarah took one step toward Jack, then another. Emily glanced at her father. Walter was watching too, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. Jack had not looked up yet. He was still staring at the floor, turning the paper cup slowly between his palms, the way he did when he was thinking. His leather vest was draped over the back of the chair. The bruising along his left side was visible even through his shirt. The doctors had told him to rest. He had lasted about 40 minutes before getting up and finding a chair where he could at least watch the room and make sure everyone was all right. Sarah stopped directly in front of him. He looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. "It's you." Jack studied her face carefully. The way he looked at her was not confused exactly. It was more like a man who had learned not to trust good things too quickly. "I'm sorry," he said. Sarah shifted Noah gently to her left arm and reached up to brush her hair back from her face. Her hand was trembling. "I was 10 years old," she said. "Grayson County. There was a tornado. It came through so fast nobody had time to get to the shelter. My mom and I were in the ditch beside the road." She paused and swallowed. "A biker stopped. He pulled us out before the second funnel came through. He stayed with us until emergency crews arrived." Her eyes did not leave his face. "That was you." The room around them had gone quiet again. Jack set down his paper cup. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression Emily could not quite name. It was not pride. It was something softer than that. Something that looked a little like relief. "Grayson County," he said quietly. "That was a long time ago." "I was 10, Sarah said again. "I never forgot your face." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How's your mama?" Sarah smiled through fresh tears. "She passed 4 years ago, but she talked about you sometimes. She said an angel stopped that day." She looked down at Noah, then back up at Jack. "She wasn't far wrong." Jack looked away briefly. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, visibly uncomfortable with the weight of what she had said. But he did not argue with it. He just nodded once, slowly. "I'm glad you're all right," he said. "Both of you." Sarah reached out and covered his large, scarred hand with hers for just a moment. "Thank you. For then. And for now." Emily had not realized she was holding her breath until she let it out. Around the room, people had been listening. Not all of them had heard every word, but enough had. The story moved quickly the way stories always do in small spaces full of people with nothing but time and feeling. A woman 2 cots over leaned toward her husband and repeated what she had heard. He turned and told the man behind him. Volunteers passed it through the kitchen doorway. The shelter coordinator stood near the supply table, with her hand pressed flat against her collarbone, listening. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance with his arms crossed. Emily had seen him watching Jack suspiciously for 3 days. Now he stood very still, and his arms were no longer crossed. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his expression had shifted into something that looked a great deal like humility. The murmuring spread and settled over the room like something warm. People began to understand. This was not a man who had shown up for one flood in one town. This was a man who had been showing up quietly for decades. Different storms, different towns, different frightened people. And then disappearing again, without ever asking for anything in return. The flood left behind a town that looked like it had been turned inside out. Mud covered everything. Porches had collapsed. Fences had vanished entirely. Whole sections of road were simply gone, swallowed by the current, and replaced with gravel and silence. People walked through their neighborhoods with rubber boots and hollow eyes, trying to figure out where to begin. Jack began on the first dry morning. He showed up at the house on Clover Street before anyone else was awake. He had a crowbar, a hammer, and a truck bed full of lumber he had sourced from a supplier 2 towns over. Nobody asked him to. He just showed up and started pulling waterlogged boards from the porch of an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who had lived in that house for 40 years and were now staying with their daughter across town. By the time Walter Parker arrived to help, Jack had already torn out the entire front section and was measuring for new planks. Walter handed him a coffee without a word. Jack took it without a word. That was how their friendship started. Over the following weeks, the two men worked side by side on house after house. Walter knew most of the families personally. Jack knew how to rebuild almost anything. Together, they made a good team. Sometimes Emily came after school and handed up tools or held boards steady while they hammered. She learned how to read a level. She learned the difference between load-bearing walls and partition walls. She asked a lot of questions, and Jack answered every single one of them with patience she had never expected from someone who looked the way he did. "You're good at explaining things," she told him one afternoon. He shrugged and drove another nail. "Only good at things I've had enough time to mess up first." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that felt easy, natural, like something that had always been there waiting. Sarah brought Noah by on weekends. The baby had started pulling himself up on furniture and taking wobbly steps between whatever surfaces he could reach. He was fascinated by Jack from the very first visit. He would crawl directly toward him and grab at the laces of his boots with both chubby hands, completely unafraid. Jack would look down at him with that quiet expression of his. Not quite a smile at first, but close. By the third weekend, he was picking Noah up without being asked and carrying him around on one forearm while he talked to Walter or checked the progress of whatever wall they were working on. Noah would grab Jack's gray-streaked beard with both fists and yank enthusiastically. Jack bore it with remarkable dignity. Sarah watched from the porch steps one afternoon with a cup of tea warming her hands. Emily sat beside her. "He's good with him," Sarah said softly. Emily nodded. "He's good with everyone. He just doesn't know it yet." The community ceremony was held on a Saturday in early autumn. The town set up a small stage near the rebuilt community center. Folding chairs were arranged in rows across the parking lot. Someone had strung lights between the trees, and they glimmered in the late afternoon air like small gold stars. Names were read aloud. First responders, volunteers, neighbors who had pulled neighbors from rising water. Each name brought applause. Each name represented something the flood had cost them and something they had found inside themselves because of it. When Jack's name was called, the sheriff was the one who read it. Brooks stood at the microphone with his hat in his hands. He spoke slowly and clearly. He talked about what he had witnessed during those 3 days. He talked about what Sarah had shared. He talked about a man who had spent decades helping strangers in ruined towns and never once waited around to be thanked. The crowd rose. Not all at once. It started in the middle rows and spread outward in both directions until every person in that parking lot was standing. The applause was loud and long and warm in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. Jack stood at the edge of the stage and looked out at the faces of people who had feared him 5 days earlier. He pressed his lips together tightly. His jaw worked once. He nodded. That was all he could manage, and everyone understood it was enough. The months after the ceremony moved with the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Jack stayed. He rented a small place on the east side of town and kept working. He helped coordinate a volunteer repair program that eventually spread to 3 neighboring counties. Emily joined as soon as she was old enough to officially sign up. She recruited 4 of her classmates before the first month was done. Walter told Jack over dinner one evening that Emily had not stopped talking about the disaster relief program in weeks. Jack looked across the table at her. "You know it's not glamorous work." "I know," Emily said. "That's kind of the point." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to eating. But the corner of his mouth turned up just slightly. That counted as a full smile from Jack Sullivan, and everyone at the table knew it. 1 year after the flood, the town held a picnic beside the river. The water was low and clean and calm, in the way rivers are when they have nothing left to prove. Children ran along the bank. Someone had set up a volleyball net in the grass. The smell of grilled food drifted across the field and mixed with the clean scent of late summer air. Emily sat with her father on a blanket near the water's edge. Sarah was nearby on a folding chair, watching Noah toddle across the grass on unsteady legs, with the determination of someone who had very important places to be. Jack was sitting on a low wooden bench a short distance away. His elbows rested on his knees. He was watching the river with a peaceful kind of stillness that Emily had come to recognize as his version of contentment. Noah spotted him. The little boy changed direction immediately, pivoting on his small feet with total confidence and toddling straight across the grass toward Jack as fast as his legs could carry him. He reached the bench and threw both arms around Jack's leg with everything he had. Then he tipped his face up toward that big, rugged man with the gray-streaked beard and the kind eyes and the worn leather vest, and he announced very loudly and very clearly the way only a 1-year-old can announce something important. "Grandpa Jack!" Laughter broke across the field. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth. Walter put his arm around Emily's shoulders. People nearby turned and smiled at one another with the easy warmth of people who shared something that could not be fully explained to anyone who had not been there. Jack looked down at Noah. He reached down with one large hand and lifted the little boy gently onto his knee. His eyes went bright. He blinked once. Then he looked out at the river again, because he needed a moment that nobody else had to witness. Emily watched him from across the grass. She saw his shoulders settle. She saw the tension he had carried in his body for as long as she had known him release quietly, like something that had been held too long finally being set down. He was not passing through. He was not disappearing back into the storm. He was sitting in the afternoon sun with a baby on his knee and a family spread out across the grass around him, and for the first time in longer than anyone knew, Jack Sullivan was exactly where he belonged. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.